Hello, class. Thank you for joining me. Today we are going to do a brief discussion on a few definitions and terminology before we can really get started in discussing second language acquisition. And I'm also going to give you for many of you, a review, for some of you, a new kind of set of information on first language acquisition. Because before we can really talk about what's special about second language acquisition, we really should have a good understanding of first. So let me start by defining some terms for you, all right? So we'll do some terms and definitions first. And these are heritage language, bilingual, age of acquisition, and then two types of bilinguals. We're going to talk about early bilinguals and late bilinguals. So, for instance, start with the heritage language, all right? Now, many people here are heritage speakers, and at UCI we see this very, very common, right? A heritage speaker or a heritage language is something that you learn from your family at home, but you're in an environment where that is not the dominant language, all right? Now, this can be a different kind of class on its own, and must really, when we're looking at what is a second language speaker, we actually have to ask the question, is this person a heritage speaker, or did they learn some other way? Are they immersed in a new environment? Is it a multi-linguistic environment? For instance, in some places in Europe, you may speak German and Polish, for instance, or you may speak Catalan and Spanish, right? Really as two full languages where the entire environment is made up of people who speak these languages. But, for instance, if you learn, Spanish and English here, but you only speak Spanish at home with your parents, this would be a heritage language, right? So you speak Spanish until you're maybe 3 or 4, maybe even 5. Then you go to kindergarten, and all of a sudden, it's very intensive with that language. So, the dominant language here, which would be English. So, for instance, for many people, Spanish is actually a heritage language. It's learned at home. It's only spoken in the family, and there's a lack of formal early instruction, right? So it's being passed on directly from the family to you, but without any necessary outside instruction. For many people, this is their first language, but bear in mind it's very important. It's a non-dominant social language, and it's a non-dominant language for the adult, which means a heritage speaker may only speak that first language a small portion of the time. This is the case for many speakers at UCI who speak Spanish, Korean, Chinese, Vietnamese. There's a large number of these languages, Arabic also. So that's the idea with a heritage language. So when we're talking about second language acquisition, we have to say, are we talking about a heritage language or are we talking about something else? Now, let's define the term bilingual. All right, so a heritage speaker could be bilingual. We're going to define a bilingual as someone who has the ability to communicate in more than one language. Now, various definitions exist, which is why we kind of have to hammer this down. And if you look at some of the book, you'll see there's really quite a nice variety of definitions, different ways the term bilingual is used and studied. But for our purposes, again, it's the ability to communicate in more than one language. Now, as I said, this means a heritage speaker is bilingual. A person who is learning a language in high school is bilingual if they can effectively communicate in the L2. For many of you who are monolingual English speakers, for instance, you may have learned another language in high school, but you don't necessarily have the ability to communicate in that language. Sometimes you do. Someone who knows a spoken language and a sign language would be considered bilingual. However, when we're talking about studies of bilingualism, we will very often exclude all of these cases. We'll very often exclude heritage speakers, people who learned in high school, someone who speaks both English and American Sign Language, and there's good reasons for that in the studies. So when we talk about the studies, when we're looking at a study of bilingualism, right, or second language acquisition, we want to be very clear on what this means. All right, that's why we have to understand what exactly a bilingual is and how it's defined. Now, something that's very inherently associated with bilingualism is called age of acquisition. So you learned a second language. How old were you when you began learning that language? Right? Like we said, for a heritage speaker, your first language could be Mandarin. And then you started going to school. right? So you learn Mandarin when you started speaking, age 1, 2 years old. You start school, start kindergarten at 5, you start learning English. I had a graduate student friend of mine who was very adamant that he was a monolingual English speaker because he'd forgotten his first language, even though his first language in that case was Mandarin. Right? Now, learning different languages can certainly have a very profound effect on the way on your language system. It's very important to look at the language history. So when we're talking about age of acquisition, what is the age at which you learn a language? Now, what does this mean? Is age of acquisition when you began learning? Is it when you reached mastery? Does it involve immersion in a second language? For our purposes, we are going to be very carefully define age of acquisition as the age at which an individual began using a language at least 50% of the time. All right? So, if we're discussing a study of bilingualism, this will be very important later. You can certainly talk about someone who started learning Spanish when they were, 20 in college. Okay? But for our purposes, we are not going to be concerned with that. We want to know when you began using a language at least 50% of the time. So we might exclude somebody who started learning when they were 10 and then just took some classes, and then 10 years later when they were 20 went to a new place. Do you understand? How we're defining age of acquisition is very, very important. All right? This does not imply immediate mastery, but it does require heavy usage, right? Speaking, using 50% of the time. Move to a new country. In that school, you're using only that new language. You're using it a great deal of the time. You may still speak your L1 at home, but you're speaking your L2 very often. This can apply to many students at UCI who moved here from one of our East Asian countries and now is using English very regularly. All right? Using it very heavily. You have to communicate in it, you take classes in it, etc. So, I also mentioned we're going to talk about two types of bilinguals. And again, this is going to be very important later when we're looking at studies of second language acquisition. But in addition to heritage speakers and high school language learners, who we've already mentioned, right, people who may not be necessarily fluent, we have these people who are fully immersed in a new language after not having experienced that language. So an early bilingual is someone who has full immersion by age 7. So we mentioned some areas in Europe, for instance, where we have overlapping cultures and maybe more than one language in a country. A Catalan speaker may begin learning that language at home and then have to take classes in Spanish. So they're using it an awful lot, but they're still speaking their first language an awful lot too. All right? Well, as long as you're being immersed in that new age language, that's what we care about. So an early bilingual begins immersion, I should say, by age 7 at the latest. We're drawing a line here. All right, you're on the early side or the late side. A late bilingual reaches immersion after age 7. All right, there's a very, very good reason for, making this denotation, right? So, for instance, age 7, right? People who start learning after age 7 usually have a very difficult time achieving a native-like accent in their second language. Okay? And a lot of studies will go over this, and we'll definitely discuss some of those. It's also true that after age 7, developing a native-like syntactic fluency is reduced. Right? The ability to put together sentences like a native speaker. Right? Now, can someone after age 7 develop native-like accent and fluency? Absolutely. Absolutely. In fact, you probably know people for whom this is the case. But that does not mean this is the regular, normal situation. Right? Because we're talking about really a generality here. All right? And we're talking about these things. We will always find case studies. Do you know what I mean? We'll always find individuals who don't fit the general pattern. But we're more likely to find the general pattern, and that's why we talk about